morning, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Mount Wachusett Community College this morning. I would like to welcome you to our first session of the Wetmore series. I would in particular like to welcome and thank Senator Anne Gobi for being the catalyst for this event, bringing folks together to talk about some really important issues, not only for Massachusetts, but for our entire region. And quite honestly, as we just celebrated Earth Day, for the earth in general. It is a great honor for us at the college to welcome you all and to host this conversation. Our natural resources programs here at Mount Wachusett Community College are a real flagship program for us. An opportunity, you know, as I drive around north central Massachusetts and I see the farms and I see the natural, beauty and the businesses that I see in north central Massachusetts, I drive by and I see a lot of jobs and I see a lot of economic drivers for our region. And in fact, yesterday, I had the opportunity to spend most of the day in a meeting with the North Central Chamber of Commerce, where we were doing some strategic planning and agriculture and agritourism and natural resources related businesses in North Central Massachusetts really came up time and again as a real selling point for North Central Massachusetts. So it all gets tied together, and we have been honored to host the Wetmore Center for many years. I'm very, very proud of and excited about the drive and the energy that our faculty, including George Locasio, who will be moderating our panel conversation this morning, brings to the students. The energy is second to none. And I have a great view from my office here at the college. I get to look out the windows behind me to see the greenhouse and the flower beds and the planting of trees. And at some point, I'm expecting and hoping that we will see a full-fledged farm here at the Mount. So we're really, really passionate about it. I would like to also let our participants and attendees know that today's session is being recorded, and it will be available for future viewing. So those of you who are attending and participating, you can let others know that may not have been able to attend, that this will be available for them to view. And information about that will be sent to the participants, and it will be posted for you to be able to view. So at this moment, I would like to introduce and welcome Senator Anne Gobi, who has been a great champion, not only for the community colleges in Massachusetts, but a great friend here at Mount Wachusett Community College, and to welcome and to continue our morning's panel conversation. Senator Gobi.
Thank you, Mr. President, and it is an honor to be here and to have an opportunity to say a few words about Senator Bob Whitmore, who this is named for. For those of you who don't know Bob, and I should have thought about this before, I did have a picture, not a great one, but it's not bad. It's a picture of Bob at one of his most beloved spots at the base of Tully Mountain. But Senator Wetmore was born in Gardner, went to the Gardner Public Schools. He was a veteran of the Korean War, came back, was a lineman, and then became very involved in politics, first being elected to the Mass House in 1964, and then to the Senate in 1976. And he served until he retired in 1996. And one thing that Senator Wetmore was very proud of was that people that had worked in his office, people that went on to establish themselves and contribute. And he was the most proud of a gentleman that's here today, and that was Senator Steve Brewer, who was Senator Wetmore's successor, who is someone that I look up to as a mentor and has blazed his own extremely important trail for environmental issues and a host of other issues. So I'm very pleased that he's here today. And I know Bob was so extremely proud of all that Steve accomplished as well. Senator Wetmore, as a lifelong conservator, if you will, for the environment and a crusader. He was actually named Conservator of the Region in 2014 by the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, mainly for his role as executor in conserving most of his aunt and uncle Roy and Marjorie Wetmore's 1,000 acres following their deaths in the 1990s, including 330 acres on and around Tully Mountain, as well as for his sponsorship of Article 97, also known as the Environmental Bill of Rights. The initiative was approved by voters in November of 1972 and became the 97th Amendment to our state constitution. And it has become the foundation for a myriad of environmental laws that we still have today and continue to follow. And that was all due to Bob Whitmore. He also established, as you know, the Special Commission on Forest Management and creation of the Mount Wachusett Community College Forest and Wood Products Institute. And the Mount honored him by creating the Robert D. Wetmore Center for Innovation, Design, Technology, and Resource Development. So this is a wonderful progression from that and continuing on Bob's strong legacy. And I want to thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank George for the work that he's doing as chair of the Natural Resources, and everyone that he's bringing in, and today, and all the great panelists that we have. So again, I thank you for that, and I'm going to turn it over to George.
Thank you very much, Senator. All right, so we will begin. All right, and so again, thank you all very much for joining us today. We're excited to have you all here for Mount Wachusett Community College first Earth Day webinar honoring Senator Robert D. Wetmore. And so thank you, Senator Wetmore, but really thank you, Senator Ann Goby, Senator Brewer, and President Vanderhoeven, really for making this happen. So there's many pieces of the puzzle that come together, and you all are definitely part of that. So thank you all. So just a few reminders before we begin. So this webinar is being recorded, but it can be viewed at a later date on the Mount Wachusett Community College Senator Wetmore page, and we will have a link to that later on. Please keep yourself muted. And if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A section, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And thank you to all of those who have submitted questions already. And so we're going to begin this webinar with individual introductions from each of our panelists. And after the introduction, we'll have a brief presentation from that panelist. And then after the three presentations, then we'll go into the Q&A section. And so to begin, we're going to start with Laura Marx. So first up today, Laura Marx. Laura is a climate solution scientist with the Massachusetts chapter of the Nature Conservancy. In this role, she's the chapter's leader for natural climate solutions for better management and protection of forests, wetlands, farms to reduce and remove carbon emissions, as well as the work to improve state policies relating to land conservation and forest management. Additionally, Laura leads the Green Mountains to Hudson Highlands linkage, also known as the Berkshire Wildlife Linkage, a regional conservation partnership focused on how forests are impacted by climate change and how we can fight against that. Laura earned her doctorate degree in forest ecology from Michigan State University and has taught at both Michigan State and Westfield State. So thank you very much, Laura. Take it away.
Thank you so much, George. I'm just going to share my slides here. And I appreciate the chance to speak to everyone today. And thanks everyone for joining us for this Earth Day webinar. I am going to talk a little bit about forest management that can help forests both prevent and prepare for climate change. But I wanted to start, in case any of you aren't familiar with the Nature Conservancy where I work. TNC is a global nonprofit conservation organization. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters upon which all life depends. And our vision is one where people are conserving nature, both for its own sake and for what it does for people. And if you are here at an Earth Day webinar, you already know and don't need to be convinced that we're in the middle of a climate crisis. But unlike a lot of the other crises that we're facing these days, we actually know how to solve this one, which is a very optimistic place to be. Right now, we need to do 3 things simultaneously to solve the climate crisis. The biggest action we need to take is to reduce emissions. Burning fossil fuels is what got us into this mess, and stopping burning fossil fuels is what's going to get us out. However, because we waited and delayed action for so long, at this point, simply stopping burning fossil fuels isn't enough. We also need ways to draw down the carbon pollution that we've already put into the air. And because climate change is something that is facing us now and not in the distant future, we also need to adapt to climate change, and we need to do all of these things at once. There are lots of ways that people are looking at to remove carbon pollution from the air. But right now, the only technology that we have that works at cost and at scale is nature. So as was mentioned in the bio, I work a lot on natural climate solutions, which are ways to protect, better manage, and restore our natural ecosystems to either reduce and or remove carbon pollution. So in Massachusetts, we're a mostly forested state. So our biggest natural climate solution here is forests. And I start with this slide because my daughter's in 5th grade, and they just did this classic experiment that trips people up of any age, no matter when you do it. So when you ask the average person on the street, hey, here's an acorn, and here's a giant piece of an oak tree. How did that happen? Where did the mass that's in this big piece of oak come from when it started out as this little acorn? Undoubtedly, they'll give you several answers. They'll say water, they'll say soil, they might say nutrients, but what they won't say is air, because it's counterintuitive to us that most of the stuff in a tree and in the forest is actually carbon that got pulled out of the atmosphere. So I was glad that her teacher did this experiment, because it's just something that trips us up because it's a little counterintuitive. But it is true that most of the carbon in the forest came out of the air. It's carbon pollution, some of it, that we emitted from fossil fuels that is now locked up in that forest. This webinar series advertised to you that we were going to talk about carbon sequestration. So I just wanted to start with a quick run through of what carbon sequestration is and what carbon storage or stocks are. So carbon sequestration is the process of removing carbon from the atmosphere that plants do through photosynthesis. It's basically the growth rate of the trees. It changes over time. So forests are always growing. That continues through their entire lifespan. But carbon sequestration in the forests we have here in Massachusetts typically peaks when the forests are young to intermediate in age. And I just, again, this morning this is going to be backwards because of the flipped video, but this forest carbon document that UMass and University of Vermont put together, it is my go-to, and I highly recommend reading it if you're interested more in this topic. On the other hand, carbon stocks or carbon storage, that's the amount of carbon that's been sequestered and is in a carbon pool within the forest. Carbon stock generally increases with age in our forests, and it typically peaks in our forests after they're 200 years old. Our forests can get much older than most of them are in the state right now. This is just showing where there are some of those carbon pools. So of course we know there's carbon in the tree trunks. There's also carbon in soils, there's carbon in leaves, there's carbon in roots, there's carbon in dead stuff that's down on the ground. And another thing that's really important to think about when thinking about forests and climate change is that there is carbon in the wood as well. So when you cut down a tree and take it off of the site, the carbon doesn't magically disappear. It's still in that wood. And if the wood products are used in long-lived applications like buildings or furniture, that carbon is stored for a very, very, very long time in those applications. One of the questions that we have been getting for a long time from landowners and other stakeholders is about this idea of climate smart forestry. People want to know, what can I do to manage my woods if one of my concerns is climate change and forest carbon? And climate smart forestry is actually surprisingly well defined. There's whole papers written about the definition of climate smart forestry. But to boil it down, it does 2 things. So climate smart forestry both maintains or increases forest carbon stocks, and at the same time maintains or improves forest resilience. And that's the forest's ability to bounce back from climate change impacts like storms and droughts. There's a third piece embedded in climate smart forestry, which is that as you are doing these types of management techniques, you are not exploiting your workers and you're not negatively impacting the community that you're in. So what does that look like? What is climate smart forest management in our forests here? We spent about 2 years trying to answer that question with a lot of different stakeholders. And I've borrowed this slide from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science from the Forest Service. Basically, climate smart actions can be the same forest actions that people have been taking for a really long time. People have known how to manage forests sustainably since long before carbon was a buzzword. There are also some places where climate smart forestry means small tweaks, so doing things almost the same way as you usually did, but a little bit different to take into account climate change. And then there are some things that are very new and different. And I like this slide, which my colleague Todd Ontel put together. Some actions that may even seem wild and crazy, so assisted migration and other things that are really new to people. So what we did over the past 2 years is we started with a review of the scientific literature. We threw everything that anyone had said was a carbon smart practice and climate smart practice in this region onto a list. Then we used a filter to say, all right, what is the normal practice here? Like, we don't tend, for example, to drop seeds from helicopters after we harvest here. So we ruled out some things that just didn't fit the region. And then we evaluated that with a team of stakeholders and experts. We did carbon modeling when the experts said, this is a climate smart practice, but I can't tell you or come to agreement on exactly how it should look like. So we'd go back to the literature, to field plots, and do some carbon modeling as well. And we came up with what my Forest Service colleagues call one list to rule them all, because they're Lord of the Rings geeks. And so it is not surprising that you will see the same practices over and over again. You'll see them in this Healthy Forest for Our Future guide that was put out by the Nature Conservancy and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. You'll see it in DCR's new publications about climate adaptation and carbon. You'll see it in Foresters for the Birds from Mass Audubon and exemplary forestry publications from New England Forestry Foundation. And just to very quickly go through 10 of those practices that attempt to balance, so they increase carbon stocks while also having a lot of safeguards for resilience and regeneration and carbon sequestration. The first of those practices is to avoid forest loss. I'm going to pause here to let the bold words speak for themselves, because lots of people get very concerned about exactly what type of management to do on a forest. But the most important action that a forest landowner or forest stakeholder can take is to keep forest as forest. We lose thousands of acres of forest in Massachusetts to development and other land uses each year, and we simply can't afford that rate if we're depending on forests not only to do all the things they've always done for us, but also help address climate change. The second set of practices are around growing new forests. If the forests we have are good, how about creating some more in places where it's appropriate? So reforestation is one of these practices. Planting trees to increase stocking is another. So this looks like perhaps underplanting some climate adapted species under ones that are projected not to do as well with climate change. Greening developed areas is another practice. This one, I think many of you probably also live out in Western Mass as I do, and this one tends to get short shrift because a lot of us live surrounded by a lot of trees and not in a city. But urban tree planting does double or triple or quadruple duty, because street and city trees are not only sequestering carbon, they are managing stormwater so that there's less stormwater runoff and better infiltration in the city. They're providing shade and addressing the heat island effect. They're shading and windbreaking buildings and reducing energy usage by that. They're increasing respiratory health and mental well-being. They just perform so many, in some cases, more functions than an individual tree out in a rural forest. The next set of practices are about reducing stressors. So climate change doesn't act in a vacuum. A lot of times it makes existing problems for forests worse. So these practices include removing invasive vegetation. And by this, I really mean things like in this top picture. People like to remove invasive species, and that's important, but there are levels of invasive infestation where there is no forest regeneration. You're just not getting new trees in. And when you get to that level, especially if you are doing a type of harvest that opens up light and growing space, it may be very important to treat and remove that invasive vegetation alongside that other management action. And then another one is protecting seedlings from deer browse, because while deer are cute, they're also very destructive to the forest. And there are places where, again, deer densities are so high that we can have almost a complete lack of regeneration. The last set of practices are around managing forests. So these include establishing forest reserves. Forest reserves are a really important part of the picture. There are places where the forests are healthy and carbon rich and packing on the carbon pounds and on resilient sites. And a lot of times in those places, landowners want to simply allow them to be managed by nature rather than doing active management on those sites. There's also a practice about increasing time between harvests. And this one I think makes a lot more sense if you think about places like northern Maine. So forests that have just been cut very intensively again and again and again. And at this point, they need time to recover. There's an added benefit of this increasing time between harvests practice, assuming it's done in the right places, because if you allow the trees to grow bigger and taller, you can often get more of the wood in higher value wood products once you do harvest at the end of that. And then we have developed a practice called Create Gaps to promote regeneration, which balances creating gaps in the canopy to get those new trees coming in with a lot of retention areas and biodiversity safeguards for things like snags and wildlife trees. And then finally, we developed a practice called retaining more carbon in a thinning, which is a fairly typical thinning, except you're removing less of the wood so that you're having more of a balance of that increase of carbon stocks while you're still taking off wood products. And again, this practice has a lot of biodiversity safeguards because we always want to be thinking about maintaining wildlife habitat even as we're doing these types of harvests. This is where you can get a copy of the Healthy Forest for Our Future guide. It describes each of these practices much better than I just did. There's a 2-page spread for each of them. And it also provides some information at the beginning about forest carbon. And for each practice, it gives an idea of funding sources, because a lot of these practices, so this one's underplanting, for example, somebody has to come up with money to buy the seedlings, the little seedling protectors. A lot of these practices do require some funding from the landowner in order to do them. And finally, I just wanted to end and segue over to our next panelist by, there's a quote from my colleague, Mark Anderson, that I use all the time. He says that caring about forests just because they're good for carbon is like caring about people just because they're good for calcium. It just doesn't make sense. And so I always try to remind landowners and stakeholders who I'm talking to that climate smart forestry is smart for a lot of reasons, and carbon may be the newest reason, and for some people it may be the most important, but usually when people are making management or conservation decisions, there's a range of reasons that they're coming to that decision, and we never want to just take a forest and all its complexity and all of its values and just boil it down to one molecule. We need to think about the whole picture even as we're thinking about carbon. So I'll end there. And again, thank you for the invitation. I look forward to the Q&A after our other panelists speak.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. That was great. Okay, so joining us next, we have Brian Hawthorne. Brian is a lifelong gardener and naturalist, and Brian left his technology career in 1999 to pursue his love for the forest. He earned his master's in forest resources at UMass Amherst and joined the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife in 2003. He now serves as Mass Wildlife's Habitat Program Manager, where he oversees the restoration and management of wildlife habitat on the agency's 200,000 acres of wildlife management areas and coordinates habitat technical assistance to conservation partners. So thank you very much, Brian. Take it away. You are, in fact, muted, Brian.
There, now can you hear me? All right, great. Thank you, George, and many thanks to Senators Gobi and Brewer, President Vanderhoeven, and the Mount Wachusett staff for the opportunity to be a part of this webinar. Laura's presentation provided an excellent introduction to the most important goals and practices for climate-smart forestry. I'd like to start with a brief overview of the Mass Wildlife Habitat Program, and then focus on how we're applying those principles to our habitat management and restoration in light of global climate change concerns. Our agency's statutory mission is a broad one: the conservation of all freshwater fish and wildlife and their habitats in Massachusetts, including endangered plants and animals. Mass Wildlife restores, protects, and manages land for wildlife to thrive and for people to enjoy. Mass Wildlife's Habitat Program is a small program and a small agency, but one that sits at the crossroads of many significant environmental and climate concerns that are facing the Commonwealth. We work with the Department of Fish and Game Land Protection Program to help identify the best parcels of land to protect valuable natural resources forever and to prevent that land from ever being developed. We manage habitat and restore ecosystem processes to ensure that wildlife and plant species have homes. And through management and restoration actions that increase climate resiliency and improve climate adaptation, we work to ensure that those lands continue to contribute to reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The core of Mass Wildlife's Habitat Program comprises 10 ecologists and biologists from the agency's wildlife section and the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. While much of our work historically has been focused on upland sites, we work closely with staff from the Mass Wildlife Fisheries section and our 5 wildlife districts, and collaborate with our counterparts in other agencies in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, such as the Division of Ecological Restoration, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Department of Environmental Protection, and Mass DOT. We also work with experts from UMass, Antioch, SUNY ESF, and other colleges and universities on biomonitoring and research. We focus much of our habitat restoration and management activities on the needs of rare and regionally declining species and their habitat, with the understanding that conserving habitat for the most imperiled species also protects more common ones. Many declining wildlife species depend on specific host plants or on specialized natural vegetation communities. Just for one example, the frosted elfin butterfly requires one of just 2 specific host plants to be growing in areas of bare sand that are amid patches of sand-playing grasslands that are located within open oak woodlands. That's the level of detail that we often have to consider in planning our restoration projects, and completing the necessary tasks to restore those habitats can take decades. The local recovery of populations of declining and rare species has been dramatic and rapid after our habitat management and restoration activities. Depending on the site, we've seen increases in the number of species of conservation concern recorded at the site, expansions of existing populations, and even detection of at least one new species previously unknown to science. That new bee species, a native pollinator, was mentioned in the monitoring report on the effects of habitat restoration on native bees at Montague Plains, prepared by UMass researcher Joan Milam. The data from her study showed that more bee species have been found at Montague Plains in the managed areas than at any other site across the Commonwealth. Incredibly, more than 50% of all native bee species known in Massachusetts now occur at Montague Plains. Milam's report notes that bee species richness and abundance were greater in managed sites with open canopies than in untreated pitch pine or scrub oak sites, and that the areas undergoing restoration are valuable for maintaining bee diversity. Other declining species use more general open habitat types, such as New England cottontail's reliance on shrubland and young forest openings, species in long-term and decline, and many neotropical migrant bird species, which use the same habitats either for nesting or for foraging in the post-fledging period to prepare for their migration. At least 134 of the 570 rare and declining plant and animal species identified in the Massachusetts State Wildlife Action Plan are known to require one or more open habitat types to survive and reproduce. Active habitat management is needed to restore and maintain those habitats if we want to save those species from extirpation in our state. Another 97 of those species regularly use open habitats, and I think it's just a coincidence that Article 97 is the Senator Wetmore's contribution to environmental justice and stability in our state. While no one specific type of open habitat is obligate for these 97 species, open habitats as a group do play important roles in the lives of this group of species. So overall, more than 40% of all rare and declining species in Massachusetts are supported by open habitats. In order to provide the habitat types necessary for these rare and declining species, the Fisheries and Wildlife Board has established an overall landscape composition goal of about 20 to 25% of mass wildlife land in open habitat types, about 1 to 2% in grasslands, 7 to 9% in shrublands, and 10 to 15% in young forests. In 2001, we had almost no native grassland habitat on mass wildlife land, and just about 1% of our upland was in shrubland. We've increased our grassland to about 1% and shrubland to 3%. While we still have a ways to go with those habitat types, we've expanded our focus now to creating young forest habitat, which represented just about 4% of the mass wildlife upland habitat as recently as 2016. Despite this focus on open habitats, it's important to note that most mass wildlife forests will continue to mature. At any time, 75 to 80% of our forest will be in a biologically mature or maturing state. The board has set a goal of attaining at least 10 to 15% of our forest as biologically mature forest, dominated by trees 120 to 150 years old and older. As Laura pointed out, our forests can continue to sequester carbon to 200 years or greater. So we consider 120 to 150 years to be the beginning of biological maturity. Most of our forests are not yet biologically mature and range in age from 70 to 100 years old. The only way to get true biologically mature forests is to wait. In 2006, as part of an EEA secretariat-wide effort, the Mass Wildlife Fisheries and Wildlife Board set aside over 15,000 acres of forest reserves. These are predominantly in large roadless natural areas, and our large forest reserves are dedicated to allowing natural processes to provide mature forest habitat over time. When you add in forested swamps, forests on steep slopes or on fragile soils, and inaccessible sites outside of those reserves, we estimate that about half of mass wildlife forests will never be harvested. Moreover, depending on the portion of young forest habitat management that occurs repeatedly in the same places versus as a shifting mosaic, the portion of mass wildlife lands that will ever be harvested could be as low as 30%. The science is clear and our partners agree. Mass Wildlife is pleased to join with the Nature Conservancy, Mass Audubon, the trustees of reservation, local land trusts like Mount Grace, and other conservation partners as we work together to conserve biological diversity in the Commonwealth through managing and restoring priority natural communities and open habitats. Our restoration and management efforts are coordinated with scientists in other states and provinces in our region through agencies and organizations such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Northeast Association of Fisheries and Wildlife Agencies, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. Providing habitat for wildlife also provides recreational opportunities for people, and many of the areas where we have restored or managed have become well known throughout the region as places to visit and enjoy nature. Birders in particular have been thrilled by eruptions of red crossbills, rare sightings of a red-headed woodpecker, and evenings filled with the haunting sounds of, whippoorwill and woodcock at dusk. Habitat management and restoration for wildlife conservation enhances wildlife observation, hunting, fishing, birding, nature photography, and other wildlife-based outdoor recreation. Mass Wildlife completes habitat site plans for every site where we propose management or restoration. Our habitat plans address climate resiliency and adaptation based on the likely changes in precipitation and temperature from national and state climate models. We consider the vulnerability of species and natural communities to climate stressors and plan for multiple scenarios. One question that is often asked is whether there's a contradiction between ensuring forests continue to play their important roles in mitigating human greenhouse gas emissions and the need to cut some trees to manage wildlife habitat for rare and declining species. For mass wildlife lands, the answer is no, there is no contradiction. We had already determined that we were able to fulfill our statutory mandates to protect biodiversity while also contributing to the Commonwealth's goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But we knew it was important to answer the question, just what is the impact of our habitat actions on carbon in Massachusetts? In 2018, Mass Wildlife continued our ongoing process of accounting for the quantity of carbon in our natural and working lands and how much they remove from the atmosphere. Our goal was to quantify the effect of our habitat activities on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. An earlier sustainable forestry accounting had ensured that our habitat management operations remove far less volume of wood than the annual growth. As of 2006, when we completed our first forest inventory, the total carbon storage in mass wildlife forests was 13.4 million tons. And I should point out for those who are climate scientists that I am speaking here in US tons of carbon and not metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Between 2006 and 2019, we protected additional forest land from development, adding an estimated 5.2 million tons of carbon to our baseline. And across all mass wildlife forests, we estimate that 1.9 million tons of additional carbon has been sequestered from forest growth between 2006 and 2019. We also have records of all of our habitat management stretching back to our first recorded timber harvest in 1966. Between 1966 and 2019, only 130,000 tons of carbon have been released back to the atmosphere from our habitat management operations. We're in the process of updating this analysis to 2021 to ensure that we remain on track. That means that for every ton of carbon released into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases from habitat activities, another 15 tons of carbon grew into storage in our forest biomass and soils, and a further 40 tons was added to our stocks from new acquisition of land protected from conversion to other uses. Put another way, the carbon releases from our habitat management activities represents less than 6.8% of the 1.9 million tons of forest carbon sequestered by growth. In exchange, we've doubled the portion of our lands which provide grassland, shrubland, and young forest habitat for rare and regionally declining wildlife species. Could we have added more carbon to storage if we had not cut any trees? Yes, we could have. How much more? We could have added about 6.8% more carbon. However, in exchange for that modest amount of foregone sequestration, we've made our forests more resilient to stressors in the face of climate change and reduced the likelihood of catastrophic carbon releases in the future. We've enhanced those forests' ability to adapt to climate changes and to remain as native forest. And we provided crucial wildlife habitat for some of the most challenged animal and plant species that are declining region-wide, while still mitigating climate change by keeping millions of tons of carbon in our forests and out of the atmosphere. By managing land for habitat diversity, including extensive mature and maturing forests, we can help the Commonwealth meet its goals for carbon storage, climate resilience, and climate adaptation, while simultaneously ensuring the full diversity of our state's wildlife and plants will be here for generations to come. And I will hand that back to George.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Brian. That was awesome. Thank you. All right. And yeah, so we have one more presentation, then we're going to go to the Q&A. So everybody hang in there. And so now joining us, we have Emma Ellsworth, an avid hunter, angler, hiker, outdoors woman, and a love of the land is in Emma's blood. She's the executive director of Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. Emma uses the collaborative skills developed in her 20 years of experience as a union organizer and negotiator to work with a wide range of conservation agencies, organizations, and individuals in her work to protect and encourage land stewardship in north central Massachusetts. She believes deeply in our need to bridge differences, foster a culture of finding common goals, and standing up for what we believe in order to be successful. And as a neighbor of Mount Grace protected property in Orange, you can understand why Emma feels passionate about protecting her backyard and is grateful to be able to call this a job. So thank you very much, Emma. Take it away.
Thank you very much, George and Senator Gobi. And it's really an honor to get to be on this panel, particularly because Senator Gobi showed the picture of Senator Bob Whitmore at Tully Mountain, and I actually live on the other side of that same mountain. So that was kind of fun. And I grew up in Montague playing in the plains. So we were much more often finding discarded refrigerators and tires than rare bird species. So it's really exciting to hear about all the fish and wildlife work in that particular area. So like George said, I'm the executive director of Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, and we're located in Athol, Mass. And the organization has been around for 36 years. We've protected over 36,000 acres. And I luckily took over from Lee Youngblood, who is the executive director there for 27 years, and really birthed an organization that was based on that foundation of collaboration. So we work with state agencies, we work with municipalities, we work with private landowners, and the vast majority of those 36,000 acres remain in private land ownership. So they're protected with conservation restrictions. But my goal here today is to really share with you my own journey, a layperson's journey. Unlike Brian and Laura, I'm not a scientist with a background in forest ecology or climate science, but it's been a path to understanding the dynamic nature of forests. I did grow up, as George said, in an outdoors family. My father was an avid runner, canoeist, hiker, and all of our family vacations and weekends were spent in a canoe on the Connecticut River or camping across New England. And nature was deeply appreciated, but we tended to move through it fast. You know, we might see eagles, we might see deer, but that wasn't really an excuse to slow down. If you're paddling a canoe, you just kind of had to wave and keep going. So nature was also medicine in our family. Being out in the woods was a cure for a grumpy disposition, for a bad day. The answer was always get outside, go for a hike, move. So then about a dozen years ago, I met my husband. He's also an outdoorsman, but he defined being an outdoorsman in a really different way than my father did. His version was growing up in a hunting family and a fishing family and as the son of a sawmill owner. So being outdoors with my husband, Tom, I started to learn how to slow down, how to actually listen, how to watch, how to be still and let the woods sink into my skin, to leave more time for really understanding what critters were doing in the woods, where they were moving, where they were at different times of the year, at different times of the day. And then, like I said, 3 years ago, I got to start at Mount Grace, and I still pinch myself that I get to call this work. I feel like I'm going to wake up any day now, but it's been a tremendous learning curve, not just about the mechanics of land conservation, but really also about the woods and answering this question of what's a healthy forest really look like? What's that term even mean? So until recently, if I had been out in, you know, some gorgeous piece of woods with tall trees and an open understory, and it felt like a park and it was deep and dark, that would have felt perfect to me. That would have felt transcendent and peaceful. Whereas if I walked in a recent forest cut, that would have looked like destruction, right? Messy and awful and sad. And, you know, I would have used the term, it looks like a bomb went off, right? That would have been my words 10 years ago. So in the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of times in the woods with our forester, our consulting forester, Mike Morey, and he's been teaching me about the importance of mixed age forest, of having a mosaic of forest age. So we think about mixed age forest as having an understory, you know, younger trees and taller trees right next to each other. Well, how about having areas with older forest right next to areas of younger forest and maybe mixed age forest? So different stands of different ages. And then I've been learning about how the critters of the woods, whether they're birds or turkeys or grouse, require that tapestry of forest ages, not just over the course of their life, but even over the course of a given day. They might roost in a big old tree and then in the morning come down to that cut to find food or do other things. So just having that endless old stage forest isn't necessarily healthy for our wildlife. So I also was under the misunderstanding that old forest, that's what we had before colonialists came and kind of messed everything up, right? That was what I would have described. So since then, I've been learning a lot about the role of managed burns, that indigenous people over thousands of years had a relationship with the woods, and they were constantly using fire as a tool for their agriculture and to maintain that healthy forest. I've also been learning about the role of beavers, right? We curtail beavers. I can only get to my house via a causeway. So if the beavers are really active, I'm a pretty unhappy homeowner because I can't get home. So we manage our beaver population actively in order to get home every night. But those beavers were essential in making sure that we had mixed age forests because they would create big flooded areas, the timber would die, it would silt in, and next thing we knew, we had a meadow, right? Change that happened over decades. We also had major floods. Now we have a lot of dams. So we've curtailed the role of floods in terms of how they manage forests. I enjoy Tully Lake, right? Tully Lake is a flood management program. I like to kayak there, canoe there just about every week. So imagining what the forest looked like before all this human intervention is a totally different tapestry than what we have right now. So the other thing that I've been learning a lot about is forest pathogens, bugs, illness that are happening in our forests. Right? I often feel like, if this might date myself, but if people remember the movie Matrix, Keanu Reeves took the blue pill and suddenly he saw a whole nother side of the world that he didn't know exists. I feel like I recently took that blue pill, because walking into the woods now, I'm seeing the woolly adelgid, I'm seeing the hemlock looper, I'm seeing trees that are weaker than they were. They're not just beautiful and pristine, but they're suffering from overcrowding. And I can't unsee that. I'm also seeing the role of stone walls, right? I love going in and seeing where walls turn in our woods, where they curve, where's the little white stone that mark the end of a day's work and where someone was getting paid. Well, that's all the mark of where we experience tremendous deforestation, right? That if you talk to anyone from Harvard Forest, you learn that basically the entire Massachusetts was deforested in the 1830s. And those stone walls are a lasting tribute to that process. So there's been hundreds of years of human intervention on our landscape. And so the result, the woods that we see now are not absent of that intervention. They're not in any way what I would have called pure or pristine, but they're in fact altered. So now moving forward and thinking about how we help maintain healthy forests, how we encourage healthy forests, how we help encourage wildlife, how we encourage our area's resilience, sometimes the best approach is no approach at all. Sometimes the best approach, and Laura talked about this and Brian talked about this, is those reserves, those areas that we're setting aside and saying, nope, the best tool is no tool. But in other areas, we have to use a much heavier hand. We have to be much more involved. So I'm very concerned. We have a couple of properties that are owned by Mount Grace that are conservation areas where we're seeing a lot of intense pathogen. And so those are stands of trees that have really no resilience in the face of climate change, where we're potentially facing mass mortality on our properties. So Laura also talked about snags, right? Standing trees that might be like riddled with woodpecker holes and teeming with insects. Those are critical for our wildlife. But a whole stand of snags, that's less critical and kind of a carbon disaster, because that's going to be the release of a lot of carbon. So the question is, in those stands where we have unhealthy trees, where we have overcrowding, where we have pathogens, can we get involved now, do some management, and try and encourage regeneration and healthier forest? So it's really been this tremendous transition for me from seeing a logging truck, seeing a skidder as a sign of death, as a sign of destruction, as a sign of sadness, to actually seeing them as signs of regeneration and future health. So similarly, I now realize when I'm walking through a slash, like at the base of Tully Mountain, Fish and Wildlife has done a tremendous forest management project. And I walk through this big open area with lots of slash on the ground that looks really unsightly, looks really messy. But now I recognize that all that slash on the ground, that's helping prevent erosion. And again, it's food for all those insects. It's great places to hide for the bunny rabbits that scoot out in front of me as I'm doing my morning walks. So it might look messy, but I've learned to see that messiness as really a source of beauty. So the other thing that I want to share is Mount Grace is planning a building project. We're in this beautiful old 1790s farmhouse in Athol, and we need more space. So we want to build what we're calling our conservation barn next door. Our goal is to have something that is environmentally sound, has a very low carbon footprint, but is also affordable. So our go-to is local wood, right? Maybe even sourced off of our own properties. And that is actually much more challenging than it would seem, because we are losing our timber infrastructure. My father-in-law's sawmill closed, but that's a part of a pattern. It wasn't just him retiring. We've seen a lot of our sawmills close. And if we lose that infrastructure, we actually lose our capacity to build locally. And that's a really critical, again, tool in our toolbox for minimizing our carbon imprint. In the last couple of weeks, I talked to 3 different families moving to our region because they are fleeing wildfires, smoke, expensive water bills across the country. They're coming here because they see this landscape as being a resilient landscape, as being a safe place to raise their families. And that's important. More and more, we're seeing people who can work remotely, who can live in Central Mass and Western Mass and have gainful employment across the country. That's an important, we need homes for these people. So do we want those homes built out of local wood? But in order to do that, we have to sustain our local timber industry. We have to sustain those sawmills. And the other thing that I want to speak to is solar siting. Laura talked about the loss of forest that we're seeing to development, right? And that's increasing exponentially. We're also losing a lot of our forests to solar development. And so it's really critical. We want solar, we need that renewable source of power, but can we do it in a way that's really thoughtful? Can we do it in a way that we're still keeping our forest and our working forest? So like Laura said, I think the greatest tool in our toolbox right now to protect our forest, to sequester carbon, to store carbon is conservation. So it's really an honor to be here with you, and I hope sharing my journey to understanding sort of what forests do and the roles they play in our life has been helpful. And then the last thing I want to share, because I'm constantly reminded by one of my coworkers, is we talk a lot about all of our uses of forest. We need them for sustainable building materials. We need them for some of the food we eat. We need them for peace and quiet, to let go of the stresses of the day. But we also need to protect forests just for nature's sake. It's not just for our sake, it's for nature's sake. So thank you, everybody.
That was excellent, Emma. Thank you so very much. And thank you to all of the panelists. Those were great. We have some awesome questions that have been coming in through the Q&A function. We have some awesome comments that are coming in through the chat in the Q&A function. And so I guess we will start our Q&A section unless somebody else feels that they would like to say something else. All right, we shall begin. So here we have a bunch of questions coming in, and we're just going to start first with a comment that came up. And so this one was, to add to Emma's points, a selective cutting in the forest can be used as an educational process by a guided hike with explanations on the why this is needed to improve our forest management. So that was a great comment that came up in the chat there. And so our first question for our panelists: will the states have a nursery of towns to use to provide the trees necessary for community plantings? And what are the long-range plans for controlling the browsing by deer and moose affecting our tree seedlings?
Well, I can take a pass at some of those. So the first things, in terms of a state nursery, we have had those in the past. many decades ago in Massachusetts. We do not currently have a state nursery. And if we did, I suspect that would probably be done through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, through their forestry folks. I know that New York has one, but also New Hampshire has an excellent state nursery that's quite nearby. So in the absence of a Massachusetts state nursery, I would encourage people to look at both the New Hampshire State Nursery program, which is very affordable for large numbers of seedlings, and also most of our conservation districts. So the Berkshire Conservation District also will have an annual seedling sale where you can get on their list ahead of time. And then again, those are very inexpensive seedlings and they're all for native species. In terms of the deer and moose browse, my agency is sort of in the middle of all of that. For deer browse, we have found that the most effective way of managing deer populations is by having controlled hunting. There is no other affordable way of reducing the deer population. People have tried sterilizing deer and all sorts of things. It just doesn't work. There are too many deer out there. It's too expensive. People have tried, hiring sharpshooters and things like that to kill deer. Really, the voluntary use of hunting by the general public is the best way to control deer population. And where we have access for hunters to get in there and to take antlerless deer, we are successful at keeping the deer population where we want it. So in the Berkshires, for example, our deer population is within our goal. Same in many parts of Western Massachusetts. In the eastern part of the state, our big difficulty is there are very few places where it is possible to hunt. Many towns have weapons discharge bylaws that prohibit the use of guns, so then people are restricted to using archery. And also the discharge either of guns or of bows and arrows near occupied dwellings is extremely limited. So we're constantly trying to add to our portfolio of state lands which are open to hunting, and also working with municipalities, with towns and cities, to try to get their town forests and other conservation lands open for hunting. Even one large town forest can serve as a significant reduction in the deer population if it's open to hunting. Whereas if it's closed to hunting, it can serve as a source of deer, so that even as we are limiting the deer population elsewhere in the town, the deer are reproducing in that one central town forest and then dispersing into the rest of the town.
George, can I just add something on the nursery piece to what Brian said?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And anybody chime in?
Sure. And Brian, you were mentioning nurseries that I was just talking with a forester who'd gotten a bunch of oak seedlings from the New Hampshire State Nursery. They were like, we're out. And then they're like, no, we found one more row. So certainly those out-of-state nurseries are a great source. I think that question, though, is really important, because with the increase in funding for reforestation and the increase in need, there's absolutely a supply problem looming with seedlings. So I think there's also a lot of efforts at the federal scale and others to try to figure out how to provide that upfront funding for nurseries to start. And here in Massachusetts, I know that regenerative design, which worked on the Healthy Soils Action Plan, has some really interesting ideas about places in urban areas where you actually can't grow small scale food. You can't do farming there because there are concerns about what is in the soil and whether the soils actually are contaminated, or whether it's just very hard and costly to figure out the answer to that question. There's a perception there that food grown there might not be safe for people to eat. So they have just started exploring, maybe those are places where you could grow trees that people aren't going to eat, where that isn't as much of a concern. Obviously, these aren't like brownfields, but areas where there's just some concern about the past land use history. So I think that's really promising, because just as those conservation districts have like small nurseries and small sales, the idea that we'd have more of those scattered around the state is pretty exciting.
That's a fantastic approach. I'm aware that in many urban areas, especially any place that's close to roads, the legacy of lead poisoning from leaded gasoline is very high in the soils. And so while things may not officially be brownfields, any place within a certain dispersal distance of a road is potentially going to have contaminated soils. But what a great idea to use those areas for growing trees.
Yes, thank you both. Emma, do you have any comments or suggestions with the nursery idea or anything like that?
No, but I did notice in the chat that the Worcester County Conservation District, they popped up and mentioned their upcoming seedling pickup and sale. So just a little shout out to their good work.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a plug for not only Mount Wachusett Community College, but my classes, we are having a plant sale today here on campus, and we do have native plants. Some of those are trees as well, like oaks. Just saying, 10-to-1 here at Mount Wachusett Community College, and tomorrow, Thursday as well. So we have a little bit of a nursery, more or less, starting up here at school. And we have a hand raised by President Vanderhooven.
George, I just wanted to say kind of a next level thing. Quite literally yesterday, I live in Keene, New Hampshire, and yesterday we went and picked up 3 tree seedlings from the Keene Public Library. And that is a program through the New Hampshire, I believe it's through the New Hampshire State, I just lost the word. What were
Nursery.
you? Nursery. Thank you. Sorry, through the nursery. And they distribute it out to the local public libraries. And it's done through the children's section. So it's done in a really educational way as well. So it's just kind of a cool thing.
Awesome. Thank you, President. Okay, so I will go to one of our next questions. So our next question that came in through the Q&A function we had, and I don't know if this is out of context, but will this program dovetail the need to protect and increase the need for local farmlands? So I think that came up during someone's presentation. But I will put that on hold for right now, and we can.
I can actually jump in on one quick statement about that. So, as part of our of the Commonwealth's 0 by 2050 program, Laura's concept of keeping forest as forest is important, but keeping farmland as farmland is also important. And so, one of our goals in the climate plan for 2030 is to ensure no net loss of forests or farms. We have a limited amount of land in the Commonwealth. We're a very small state. We're about the size of some of the western counties, and as you can see from the picture behind me, most of it is forested. We need to ensure that we make wise use of every acre of land. So if there is land that is a brownfield, what a great place to put a solar installation. If land is already forested, let's keep it forested. If land is already farmed, let's keep it in a farm and not build a housing development on it. So the approach to that is going to have to be a carrot, not a stick. We need to provide the incentives to developers to correctly site the real estate development that we need to ensure that we are not losing forests or farms.
And George, I just want to jump on that also. Mount Grace has a long history of protecting farmland, and so often our farms are tied to working woodlots. So as anyone knows who's made maple syrup, that requires a whole lot of heat, which many of our farms use their own woodlots to make their maple syrup. Red Fire Farm in Montague has an active woodlot, and doing regular timber harvest helps keep the farm viable. Stone Cow beer, I'm using a Stone Cow coffee cup this morning, but they use their own wood to make their beer and their beer making process. So I think the conservation of our working forest and our working farmland are totally interconnected.
Excellent, awesome. And actually, we had I guess tying directly into that, we did have a question that came up in the chat function. Can someone comment on the connection of conservation and food security in our region? Utmost importance.
This this is a hard question. I think I'm just going to point people towards a resource because there's a resource out by Wildlands and Woodlands that is sort of a plan across New England for how could you balance the need to have the majority of the landscape forested, but more farms even across the landscape than we have now. So the Wildlands and Woodlands visions and pieces are really useful, even with sort of percentages, like what might it look like in 2050 if we met this. And then I'm hoping I'm getting the name right of this. There's a paper, I think, called the New England Food Vision that I read a while ago, and it was fascinating because it was talking a lot about what kinds of foods can we grow here in New England and how would people's diet shifted if they were sort of more dependent on this. It was just a really interesting, I think, kind of piece that made me think differently about, what foods can be local. We can't grow everything here. So what can you grow in New England? What's realistic? And it's also probably a challenge. I remember looking at that and being like, oh, it would cost a lot of money to eat that way. But I think that the point of the piece was not to get everyone suddenly to switch their whole diet, but more to kind of think about and be aware of, oh, that was maybe grown locally or could be. That'll never be able to be grown locally. How much of each of those things am I eating? And just kind of think a little bit more about that. But I agree with what Brian said there. Right now, we still have a lot of forest comparatively. We have a lot of unprotected forest that's at risk of development. There certainly are states that are closer to build out. At some point, you do get to the point where you need to be making trade-offs in terms of land uses. So it's good both to be thinking about the situation we're in now and then looking ahead. Okay, 30, 40, 50 years from now, what would we ideally like to see in a way that would provide people with places to live, leave us with enough forest to filter our drinking water, have our agricultural system be as strong as it can, as much as possible, knowing that at that point there will be trade-offs. There's no perfect answer, but sort of how close can we get? So I realize that's not a great specific answer to the question, but both of those are resources that I read for the first time years ago and just keep coming back to in my head just because of the way they made me think differently about things.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah. And now that you mentioned it, I do remember that report when it came out as well. And that was a very interesting kind of vision for New England. Okay. So our next question that we had come up in our Q&A. So are the speakers seeing significant issues in our local forest related to pests and diseases? We did hit upon that a little bit. And what impact do these stressors have both on forest health and greenhouse gas emissions?
I'll jump in here first then. Yes, the answer is yes and huge. To be a little bit more specific, pests and pathogens, pests and forest diseases are a significant issue. What we're seeing is that they unfortunately interact with the climate stressors. So that as we are seeing forests that are being stressed either by drought, or by changes in temperature or changes in the timing of precipitation. When those forests are stressed and then an exotic pest comes in, like the spongy moth, formerly gypsy moth, then they are much more susceptible to dying from the repeated defoliation by the moth. It's a serious issue, and what we're looking at is, there is no real solution for many of these pests, especially. We're looking at what Laura was talking about, some of those wild and crazy ideas as potential solutions. So they're twofold. One is biocontrols. So for example, for the emerald ash borer, there are a number of insects that are predatory on the emerald ash borer that are being considered and that are actually being tested now as biocontrols. That's a very complicated issue because you don't want them to become a problem with your native insects. But they have been very successful in many areas. The other one is the idea of assisted migration. So as our climate changes, and as we know that trees from more northerly latitudes or higher elevations are going to be more stressed by the climate, then we look at underplanting some species that might be more able to survive that climate stress and therefore fight back against the pests and pathogens. The reality is, we have pretty much every tree species out there. There is some exotic pest or pathogen that is impacting it now or is on its way to impact it. And we're not going to get rid of all those. So we have to ensure that we have forests that are as resilient as possible, and that means ensuring that they aren't a single species monoculture, that they are not a single age class. All of those things lead you to the situation of entire forest stands dying all at once. The more we can diversify the species, diversify the age classes and the structure of the forest, the more resilient the forest is in the face of those stressors.
I just want to come back to an image that Emma used, which I loved, when Emma, you were saying, you walk through the woods and you're like, oh, look at that great snag and wildlife tree. There's like things nesting in it. But if the entire forest was like that, you might have a different impression. And I think that with a lot of the pests and pathogens are a huge problem. And yet at the same time, we always have this issue of what our baseline is. So you notice the difference in the forest compared to what you saw it look like, comparatively not that long ago, because trees live a lot longer than we do. And so while I agree that with everything Brian said, like it's a huge problem, I also take some comfort in just watching those forests that are healthy and resilient, and how they have not, suddenly keeled over and turned all into snags when there's a pest and pathogen that comes in. Someone was asking me the other day, when you were in Michigan doing your grad work, was hemlock woolly adelgid there? And I said, oh, no, it was kind of like just creeping in. And it's been there now for a long time. Those forests are sort of managing it. They're huge, well-managed, in many cases, old growth forests. This pest and pathogen comes in, and certainly it causes destruction, but for all the reasons Brian was saying, because they have a variety of tree species, because many of them are old enough that they're sort of all aged, it is more manageable, I think, than sometimes people fear. And the bigger impact is, again, as Brian mentioned, like diversity and resilience are protective. The bigger impact would be, a single species stand. You could get something like Emma was talking about, where you just had rows upon rows of snags. So I often spend time with landowners who are really freaked out about this, and they think everything's going to die in 10 years. And, there's a balance there of sort of like, yes, be concerned about it, but there are certainly forests that are going to be able to withstand a couple of those challenges, and trees will die, and they'll die slowly, and they'll be replaced with other things. And but it won't, I think, in many cases, be the catastrophe that some people fear is going to happen to their own forest.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian and Laura. Emma, do you got anything?
No, I was just going to add sort of to what they were both saying, that we often see all these factors pile on top of each other. Right, so it's not like hemlocks are just facing woolly adelgid or just facing, climate change, weather impacts. It's that they're facing years of drought on top of the woolly adelgid, on top of, this year in our forest we're seeing the hemlock looper, which is a native pest. It hit us 30 years ago with pretty, is pretty nasty from what I hear, over a short period of time, and then the trees withstood it. But now the trees are already weakened. So again, no one's facing any of these pathogens singularly. they're facing sort of an onslaught, which is, I think, to say Laura's point, which is great, which is our forests are tough. So maybe they just need a helping hand, but otherwise they got it under control.
Awesome. Yes. And that's a great point that segues into our next question. So our next question is, landowners want to do the right thing for the woods that they own. They want to help wildlife. They want to contribute to climate solutions, but they often don't know where to start. So what advice would you all give to landowners as kind of guidance for managing your woodlot? What would be kind of foundational things that somebody who owns a woodlot could do?
Find a licensed forester and hire them. Talk to your neighbors and get a recommendation for someone that meets your goals and your needs, and work with them individually.
And I would add to that you don't need one solution for your whole land, right? Like if I have 40 acres, then there might be one solution in one piece. I might have a beautifully healthy stand, and we're not touching that, versus adjacent to that, there's an area where I want to manage more heavily. So being really flexible and really site specific.
And I'm looking for a resource on my other screen in case people are wondering why I'm no longer looking at them, which I think I can chat to everyone. I'm going to try it. Yes, great. So Brian, this is the answer we give every landowner, right? Like all of us, we're like, go talk to a forester. So you can find a licensed consulting forester. You can talk to one of the DCR service foresters. Part of their job is coming out to people's land to kind of get them started and thinking about what is the right management choice for them, given their values and their wood. Masswoods.org will show you those foresters and all sorts of resources. I also just put a resource in the chat that is that one list to rule them all that I mentioned. So a number of stakeholders came up with climate smart practices. Some of them focused a little bit more on carbon stocks. Some of them focused a little bit more on adaptation. But one of the questions that we all asked ourselves in preparing that list, which only has, depending on how you count them, 13 or 14 practices, so it's not overwhelming. Our Forest Service facilitators kept people focused on the question, do you feel good about this? Do you feel good about recommending this to your clients? Would you feel good about seeing this on your land? So for someone who is trying to make decisions, I think they, with the help of a forester, could look at that list, and many, not all, these won't cover, for example, a forest that's in need of restoration, or as Brian mentioned, if you're specifically, one of those rare species, it just has very, very specific requirements. But for a general average condition forest, these might be a good starting point for people because they can look through and start to think about which ones of those resonate with them without having, I think, to worry that, okay, but I don't want to do something that runs into this value. These do a reasonably good job of balancing them. But again, Brian's advice is really key, because a forester is going to be the one to listen to a landowner's goals and values and match them up with the right practice.
And I will add, just for those who don't know, that foresters work for lots of different people. So like a real estate agent, you want to make sure that you have a forester who's working for you and not for someone else. So many sawmills, for example, will have what's called a procurement forester, and their job is to go out and find landowners. They're great foresters, but they work for the mill. And you want to have your forester. So when you reach out on masswoods.org, find a professional, you want to ask them, who do you work for? Are you working for me, or are you working for someone else? And there's actually a form they're supposed to fill out from DCR. That's their appointment of agent form that basically says, I work for this person. I work for the landowner. So you want to make sure that you have that figured out when you choose a forester.
Excellent. That's awesome. Great suggestions there. And I guess just as a plug too, there is a really good book that I use for my classes called More Than a Woodlot, and it's for the homeowner And my students read that book, and it really helps guide you through talking with a forester. So that's something landowners could use as well. And it's a really good book that is based here in New England to talk to a forester. Okay, so in lieu of time, this might be the last question. But so I guess kind of dovetailing on that, we had a question that came in the chat. So how about some discussion on how better to manage and management can lead to improve, say, timber quality and faster growing, thus increasing sequestering carbon trees. So how do we do land management to maybe have it so that we do have some timber interests there?
That is a tricky question. There's
Yeah.
a lot of things in there.
The answer is it depends.
Yeah, for sure.
Brian, did you want to go ahead and take that?
No, you can go ahead. I'll throw something in if you don't want to.
I think so. Often when I think about management, I'm thinking of management across the whole landscape, across all of Massachusetts, across a big part of Massachusetts. And because in Massachusetts, most of our forests are owned by family forest owners who own a small amount of land, we do have a wide range of management approaches. We have people who aren't harvesting. We have people who are harvesting primarily for wood products. We have people who are harvesting primarily for specific wildlife species, and that's positive. That gives us sort of this mosaic of management types across the landscape. I think my general answer to that question would be to remember that people called carbon wood for a long time before they called it carbon. So the type of forestry that grew an ever increasing supply of, more wood, more carbon, larger trees, more valuable products also tends to do pretty well from if you're looking primarily from a carbon standpoint. And sometimes I worry that when we couch it in these climate change terms, we might lose that connection to the fact that there have been, good, responsible, ecologically minded foresters managing our forests for wood and other things for a really, really, really long time. And, as Brian and Emma mentioned, climate change is shining a light on some of the situations and threats that were already in our forest. It's making some of them worse, but we don't need to feel like we're starting from scratch and like everything that happened before isn't taking into account climate change, because again, wood is about 50% carbon. So if you're growing good, valuable wood, you are probably increasing your carbon stocks, assuming you're harvesting at a rate that is sustainable. And I'll hand things over to you, Brian, if you have other thoughts.
Well, I was just going to throw in, and then of course the practices that Laura mentioned in the climate smart forestry are all attempts to provide those slightly different ways of doing things that will improve the production of and storage of carbon. So again, foresters know how to grow trees. That's what they do. It's silviculture. It's growing forests and growing trees. But it's important that we recognize that every landowner has multiple goals. Landowners want to be able to look out in their woods and see animals. They want to be able to hike through their woods. They want to help to contribute towards ameliorating climate change. Everyone has, and a lot of them also need to get some money from their woods in order to pay their taxes, so that they can keep the land forested and not have to sell off a house lot every now and then in order to afford to keep that land. So there's multiple goals that every landowner has, whether that landowner is a private landowner, a nonprofit, or the Commonwealth or the federal government, and we have to manage for all of those goals. Fortunately, they are not contradictory. It's possible with good climate smart forestry to reach all of those goals on any given forest stand.
Excellent, awesome, thank you very much. And Emma, what do you have
Well, I guess my only addition is that forestry it's a science and it's absolutely informed and based on science, but I also appreciate it as an art form with a 40-year paintbrush.
Yeah.
So, as I've learned, foresters, have ideas and concepts and they're working with landowners and trying to do things and they don't really know if their goals have been achieved for decades. And so it's really an extraordinary practice and requires a lot of patience on the forester's part, the landowner's part. So it's and balancing, like Brian said, all of those competing priorities and sort of weaving things together. I think the most important thing is that your canvas is really site specific. And so every woodlot's going to have rocky parts and wet parts and rich soil parts and sandy soil parts. And so basing priorities on what's really in front of you seems the most critical piece.
And I'll throw in one other thing, which is, we said we want to keep forests as forests. One way to do that is for individuals to voluntarily protect their land from development in the future. Most local land trusts are always willing to work with landowners to help put conservation restrictions on their land. That's something that you can do to ensure that when you're gone, that your land doesn't turn into a real estate development, that stays as a forest. So that's something that I highly recommend that people consider. If you go to that masswoods.org link that I put in the chat, they have a lot of information about legacy planning as well as how to find a forester. It's a great resource. It's run by the folks at UMass Extension. So definitely check that out for all of those needs.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And we got 2 minutes left, so we're going to unfortunately wrap up the Q&A right now, but we have an awesome comment that came into the chat. Love the 40-year paintbrush analogy. Thanks, Emma. That was an amazing comment. And then right after that, thank you, Emma, for mentioning the aesthetic value. Absolutely. So yes, it absolutely comes down to humans as well. We like looking at pretty forests as well. Okay, so we're going to wrap up our webinar. And so I just want to say thank you all for joining our Earth Day webinar honoring Senator Robert D. Wetmore. And thank you, President Vanderhoeven. Thank you, Senator Ann Goby. Thank you, Senator Brewer. Wouldn't have happened without all you folks. And so for more information, you can visit the MWCC webpage that is dedicated to Senator Wetmore, and that's where this video will be posted. We're also going to send out a kind of wrap-up email with contact information for all of our panelists and some more further information. So if you have questions that didn't get answered, or if you have thought of a question later on, you can always ask one or all of our panelists. And here at MWCC, we have a slew of Earth Day events going on all this week. So I already made a plug for my Green Society Club and my greenhouse management and horticulture classes. We are having our little plant sale and native and crop plant sale here Wednesday and Thursday from 10 to 1 on our campus. So have a little bit of a nursery starting up here, of which we do have some oak trees you could plant. So little plug for that. And yeah, we are planning to do this type of webinar and event in the future, in the fall. We do not have it scheduled just yet. So feedback on question, comments, concerns, answers, we appreciate that. So we are planning to do something similar like this into the fall. So I just want to plug that coming up, although it is not scheduled just yet. So we are at our time, but do we have any quick comments from Senator Ann Goby, our President Jim Vanderhoeven, or Senator Brewer, or our panelists?
Thank you, everyone. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for the amazing questions. Thank you to all of our panelists. And so until next time, we will see you all here at the Mount.